All the signs point to Andrea Berta joining Arsenal as their new sporting director. But Arsenal fans a few months ago probably had rarely ever even heard his name. So to find out a little bit more about the Italian, I've got a fantastic expert joining us on this morning's Arsenal News Show. Hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk, back with you guys for another episode of our Arsenal News Show. Very happy to be joined this morning by Spanish football correspondent for The Guardian and co-host of the Spanish Football podcast. It is Mr. Sid Lowe. How are you doing, mate? You good, you well?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. It was nice to break eggs, I think is the saying, isn't it? Is it break eggs? Is that the saying? I'm going mad now. Break bread? Break bread. I think that might be the saying. Break bread in Girona. We first had an opportunity to speak with you. I mentioned, of course, getting into journalism through listening to the Spanish Football podcast from years, back. So it was nice to put a face to the name and the voice of the podcast, of course. Do you want to give listeners just a quick, brief outline as to your role in the Guardian?
Essentially, it's just anything Spanish football. I've been fortunate enough that it's been such a long time now that I largely do what I want to do, which is nice because it means that you get away from the inevitable kind of sort of gravitational pull of Madrid and Barcelona, and it puts you in a position where you can talk about other clubs and go and see other clubs and get a broader, wider picture of Spanish football.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, being in a position where I'm just covering Arsenal, it can be quite hectic. So having a position to cover more broadly, an entire culture of football as well in Spain must be a real joy. But from an Arsenal point of view, big news, of course, coming through last week ahead of the game against Manchester United, and the news that Andrea Berta looks increasingly likely, it seems, to be becoming Arsenal's new sporting director. Before we go into kind of the finer details about his work at Atletico and what he's done with Diego Simeone and some of the transfers there, could I just get a little reaction from you about the idea of him moving to the Premier League and to Arsenal after so long, in Spanish football?
Yeah, I mean, look, the truth is, I think that he was in a position because of the nature of his contract that he was likely to look for a way out in the summer. His departure from Atletico Madrid was earlier than anticipated, but really only by 5 or 6 months. And so the fact that he would be looking for clubs in the Premier League, I think in this summer was always going to be likely. There was a period in which I think both Paris Saint-Germain and a couple of Saudi clubs had come looking for him as well, and he wasn't that keen on it. Admittedly, it's true that we thought there were a handful of other good targets for Arsenal, and obviously a lot of talk about Roberto Alaba, who's the sporting director at Real Sociedad. But I think Andrea Berta, the fact that he's going to the Premier League doesn't really surprise anybody. And as I say, if anything, this is really just a kind of bringing forward of something that was quite likely to happen anyway.
Yeah, I think that from an Arsenal point of view and from a fan point of view, Alaba was kind of for a long period seen as, it seems, a bit of a no-brainer at the time because there were so many links with Mikel Arteta, of course, and all the transfers between Real Sociedad and Arsenal with Kieran Tierney, or I remember Nacho Monreal going there on a free, and of course Martin Odegaard prior to joining Arsenal, who spent time on loan there also. There seemed so many links that it was almost obvious, but I get the sense that maybe there's a need for him to take something of a break after this stint with Real Sociedad rather than jumping into straight away another massive job.
Yeah, I think Roberto Alaba is a really interesting character. He's I think really quite reflective. I think he has a sort of a kind of a sensibility about him that makes him slightly unusual within football. I must admit, I'm the same as you. I felt that when that story broke that he was walking away from Real Sociedad, I think obviously on the one hand, there's two elements to it, obviously, isn't there? There's one is the departure and one is the potential arrival elsewhere. But I, like you, took it to mean that, okay, Arsenal's a very, very strong possibility because of those links, because I think he's aware that the English football is where the greater money is, where you can maybe build a project, where you can have a coach that probably fits with your idea. There, of course, the Mikel Arteta is from San Sebastián, which is the city where Real Sociedad is. I think that the conceptualization of what football means and what its place is within its kind of environment, I think, was shared, and so it did feel like a relatively logical one. But I do think that Alaba is a slightly different character in that sense. I don't think he's particularly hard-edged. I personally think it's a good thing. Obviously, I suppose it depends what a football club is looking for, but I personally think it's a good thing. I think there's a degree of, I don't know if fatigue is quite the right word, but there's a degree of fatigue in this job. I think that's probably true of anyone in any job. But I think Alabe was aware of that, and I suspect that we'll see him turn up somewhere reasonably big, reasonably soon. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if he did take his time before looking for somewhere else to go now.
On to Berta then, because I think Arsenal fans will be looking at this as quite. I don't know if I'll put the word dream in front of this, but I'll give context to that word. For a long time, I think Arsenal fans have wanted Arsenal to go into that sphere and find an individual who had worked at a club who are very much competing for the biggest honours, and somebody that had completed massive transfers with huge fees, particularly in the forward line. And if there's one club that are known for signing centre forwards and having quite, a reasonable amount of success with it, Atleti would fall into that category. So when Berta really emerged, there was a bit of fanfare, I think, from fans about this. As this is matured and marinated, I think, over the last week or so, there's been more reflections that I think have maybe balanced that out a bit more. And there's been, as it looks like it's not so much a dream, but more a reality. Obviously, naturally, you start to look at the pros and the cons. And I think that Arsenal fans in general have looked at some of the high-profile names that have moved for big money that haven't worked out at Atletico. The fact that there's been some signings there that I think if they were made at Arsenal, you would look at that and think, is that the right way to spend money on that profile or age profile, particularly of a player? But what do you make of the work that he's ultimately done at Atleti? And do you, it's a big question to start things off, but would you see it being kind of a successful appointment at the club?
Well, as you say, it's a big question. It's a very broad one, and at the risk of taking the coward's route out, let's start with context. And I think the context is really important to all of this. And obviously, the context with Andrea Berta. First of all, by the way, he's really an intensely private person, and I think it's been very interesting how little we've heard from him over his time at Atletico Madrid. I think I'm right in saying that he joined the club 11 years ago. He didn't initially join the club as a sporting director, but his role was more about international scouting and finding players and working under José Luis Caminero at the time, who was the sporting director. There's then a restructuring the club when Caminero goes, and he takes on this role, which is closer to what we would now call that sporting director's role. But it takes in things like the first team, the reserves, the academy system, and so on. And he always still talked about that first word to define his role, which is in Spanish is captación, which is, I suppose, essentially scouting and discovering and identifying players. And not always, certainly in that first spell, not always being the person who actually then goes and does the deal. So not always being the person who necessarily has to deal with the financial side of it, the negotiation side of it, the contracts and so on, but more about being someone to identify and see players. And so, for example, you get that idea of him being the person who spots players young. And funny enough, I think actually possibly the player that most gets talked about in those terms is one they didn't sign, and that's Lautaro Martinez. And they had him basically tied up and then effectively got gazumped on him. Now, again, that talks a little bit to that idea of it's one thing to see a player, it's one thing to do the legwork, it's one thing to build those relationships and feel that you have a place for that player. It's another thing sometimes to close the deal. And so this is what brings us to the context. Now, Atletico Madrid, there have been a handful of different people involved quite often in some of the signings they've made. And so, for example, you have Miguel Ángel Gil Marín, who's what's always known here as the consejero delegado. He's essentially the CEO, but he's the CEO who's basically effectively the owner of the club as well, or one of the majority shareholders of the club. And of course, he's the son of the late and rather infamous president, Jesus Gil. So he's involved in a lot of these deals. You had a period, as I say, where Berta was working under Caminero, and Caminero would be doing some of these deals. Then he takes over that role. But then inevitably, a club like Atletico Madrid, with a manager both as significant in terms of their success and as charismatic and as public as Simeone, there's always a degree of different roles being played in terms of who you sign. And so sometimes you go through this list, and I was actually looking at the list earlier on today and thinking, given that some of these guys were not particularly big when they first came to the club, but Oblak, for example,
Yes.
Jimenez, who only cost 800,000 euros, and at the moment that seems like a fantastic business. Apart from his injury problems, he's been phenomenal. Rodri, who of course now is a Ballon d'Or winner, came to Atletico Madrid. Now, in part though, this wasn't a player that was a huge surprise in that he was doing very well at Villarreal, and I think Rodri himself, saw it as an opportunity to shift to a different style with Simeone. But that was Berta's doing, but with Simeone finding a place for him. And then, of course, inevitably, you get this process over the years. And I think we've got the figures here for you. 43 departures and 52 signings in his period. So there's been a lot of in and out. So it depends, doesn't it? If you look at it and go, okay, let's go for the good ones. Wow, amazing. Let's go for the bad ones. You go, oof, not so sure about that. As I say, the context is that there are different people involved in some of those processes. And in that inevitably brings, I think, occasionally a disparity of criteria. But I think what we have seen is someone who has been able to do some pretty big deals for some players that haven't worked, some pretty big deals for players that have worked. You mentioned the strikers, and Atletico pre-Berta, and I think it's really important to make this point, pre-Berta, and this still Simeone era, but sort of pre-Berta, that process of finding strikers that Simeone liked was quite difficult. And the best way of, I think, underlining that to you is to say that you look at they bought a lot of strikers over this period, but they bought Diego Costa back, partly because Simeone kept looking for a Costa and couldn't find one, so ended up getting him again. And then actually he wasn't the same player again. Griezmann went and came back. Morata's always seemed to be in the orbit of Atletico Madrid. You look at the really, I mean, the most successful, in my view, single kind of arrival as a striker, as a goal scorer is Luis Suarez. And really and truly, that was a one-off one-season deal, which helped them win the league. So there's a whole load of context to it. The other thing I feel like I should say at this point, and it's an uneasy one, because it's difficult to always know exactly where the balance lies. But that is the perceived, and I also think real, but maybe not quite as real as sometimes it's perceived to be, influence at Atletico Madrid of Jorge Mendes. And Mendes was someone who actually recommended Berta to Atletico Madrid in the first place. And I think there is sometimes a rather facile assumption made that Atletico Madrid have too often been prepared to spend big on Mendes' players and maybe not on players belonging to other agents.
I think Arsenal fans will listen to that and have concerns. I think with Edu,
I think sometimes it's overplayed, and I think that's
the thing. I hear
you. In a way, I would urge concern about the concern, if you sort of mean. And I also that influence with Mendes is actually not. The other thing I think is important to say here is I don't think that's about Berta, or at least not solely about Berta. I think it's about echelons of the club that are even higher than him.
More Atleti than
yes.
With Edu, there was always kind of this link to Kia Jarabchin quite a lot with Arsenal, and at the start of his tenure in particular, there was quite a few clients of his that were linked to and moved to Arsenal. I remember Cedric coming in right at the beginning of his tenure, Willian as well, another. And it felt like the longer Edu's tenure was with Arsenal, the less and less Kia clients there were really associated. And I think that most people would put that more down to Arteta's growing power at Arsenal in particular. I think that potential dynamic between a manager in Arteta who, when Arsene Wenger left, a lot of people felt like there would never be a manager at Arsenal again like that who would wield such kind of influence. And especially when Unai Emery came in and left pretty swiftly after, a disappointing start to his second season with the club. Again, that kind of felt like, well, this is going to be the metric. We're going to see a manager come in, they're going to either fail or do well, and eventually trail off and leave. But with Arteta, it's been very Wenger-esque, the rise with power almost at the club. And he was promoted to manager after his first season, winning the FA Cup, of course. Edu has come and left mid-project, which a lot of people see as also concerning. So how has his relationship, Berta, with Simeone been? Because Simeone, you think of Atleti, you think of Simeone these days, and there's so much more to the club than that, but he is such a big face and such big presence and influence. So has that I know you talked about context and roles, but has there been any signals that relationship could imprint upon, say, the upcoming potential partnership with Arteta and how that may, mesh?
Well, I mean, the fact that you've sort of set this up around Arteta and that question mark about Arteta and Edu and what the relationship will be like, I think really leads us to kind of the key question that people always ask. And in a way, I suppose this is the oldest story. Well, it's not the oldest story in football. It's the oldest story in modern football, isn't it? That question of how well a sporting director fits with a coach, how much the coach wants to be more than the coach and wants to be a manager and wants to identify his own players and wants to bring them in, or at the very least identify them and allow someone else to do the business to bring them in. And I think it's inevitable that in a scenario like that, you're going to get a moment when a manager wants a certain player and a sporting director brings him someone else. Now, it's not always going to be that famous Rafa Benitez remark when he was at Valencia when he said, I asked for a sofa and they brought me a lamp. It's not always going to be quite like that. But there is always going to be a moment where the players that come in are not necessarily what you want. And Simeone, for example, has been after what an Argentinian at least would always refer to as a number 5 for a long time. That deep midfielder that's positional, that moves the ball well, that does a little bit of everything. And it hasn't always, that desire hasn't always been satisfied. If you look at the players who currently play in the middle of midfield, you've got Rodrigo de Paul with the Argentinian influence. And I think it's possibly a little too easy, but we do tend to see him as a Simeone signing. Although there's no doubt that Berta was involved. And of course, remember that he came from Italy. But the other two that play in that role are Koke, who's a youth teamer who's been there for the best part of 15 years now. Yeah. And Pablo Barrios, who's a youth teamer coming through. And there was a young Belgian called Arthur Vermeeren who Berta signed and brought him in. And I think I'm right in saying, I can't remember, but I think I'm right in saying he was only 18 or 19.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And they signed him for 22, 23 million euros. And Simeone actually played him the first day. And I must admit, and this is possibly the cynic in me, and I do think there's a tendency sometimes to see this. I think a few of us, I'm not the only one, wondered if Simeone had partly played in the first day to say, right, well, let's do this. Let's go cut straight to the chase and do sink or swim.
Yeah. We'll do this your way.
Sort of good enough. It's not my fault. I'm going to play him right from the start. And he didn't play very well. In fact, he was really quite poor. And he was gone within 6 months. And I think what tends to happen in a scenario like that is that there is an assumption that that's because the manager didn't like what the sporting director brought him. Now, that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be some players, but there's also kind of a three-way thing. And if you look, for example, at the signings from last summer, there is a feeling, for example, that Simeone was very much behind the Julian Alvarez signing. In fact, Simeone was on Julian's back all the time. And again, it's possibly a little bit facile to talk about it as being an Argentinian, wanting an Argentinian player. But there's no doubt that Simeone put a huge amount of interest in bringing Julian Alvarez to the club and making the effort. Other players, for example, Conor Gallagher, I think was more pushed by the club's CEO, by Miguel Angel Gilmarin. And then you've got Berta pushing for some of the other signings, like Robin Lenormand, for example, from Real Sociedad. And so you've got this kind of freeway thing anyway. And I actually think, in a way, what's really changed and what's really kind of precipitated the departure of Berta isn't so much about Simeone. It's about us restructuring at a slightly higher level. So in January, Atletico Madrid brought in two big executives. One's a guy called Oscar Mayo, who was at La Liga, and he looks after the financial side of things and the organization side of things and the institutional side of things. Another's a guy called Carlos Bucero. It's a former agent who'd worked with Pedro Mijatovic and had been at Real Madrid. And Bucero is in charge of, I suppose, what you would call the department of football, everything. And essentially what happens there is that Berta becomes a little bit more secondary. And I think what we tend to do is assume that that's about the coach. And it's not always about the coach. And actually what people at the club will tell you, and admittedly, I do think there is sometimes a desire to smooth some of the rough edges. But what they will tell you is that the relationship between Berta and Simeone was always really good, right to the end. Yes, there were moments when the discussions. Yes, there were moments when Simeone thought, not sure about this guy that you've bought me. Or Berta thought, well, I'm not sure that Simeone is giving sufficient opportunities to this player that I bought him. And we'll come on to this, I'm sure, in a minute. But João Felix is the kind of the classic case here.
Yeah.
That's the really headline one. But I actually think that the relationship was reasonably good. Now, bear in mind in all of this that Simeone is different even to Arteta. Even with Arteta's increasing power, Simeone is the guy that absolutely revolutionized this club. And in a way, Simeone at times is a victim of expectations that only he has created. He's created an entirely new dynamic and an entirely new reality, which changes the financial shape of the club, changes the expectation levels of the club, changes the desire of what they want to do. And from the outside, I'm not sure how much people in England follow this, but Atletico Madrid, it feels to me, over the last 6 or 7 years, have constantly had this debate about what they want to be, what their identity is. And periodically, you get this period where you get this time where people say Simeone's too defensive for the quality of players he's got. Now, of course, they can only get that quality of players they've got because of everything that Simeone has done. So Simeone then has to evolve. And quite often you get this feeling that there's a slight disconnect between the players brought in and what Simeone would like to do. Now, I personally think that exaggerates Simeone's defensiveness. But it certainly is true that there's a kind of general desire, which I think Berta was part of, to expand into something a bit more open, stylistically, tactically, and so on. And Simeone at times would embrace that, and other times would think, actually, let's go back to what we know. And there was a famous comment from Simeone, and this tells you how long this kind of evolve into something, then evolve back again, then evolve again, and then kind of come back again. I think it's at least 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe even longer. And I remember Simeone coming out and saying, "We like pizza." People talk about wanting, to have this wonderful Michelin-starred restaurant, but we like pizza. It's what we do. And so I think there has at times been a disconnect, but I wouldn't see those necessarily as red flags, to be honest with you.
It's interesting because Arteta did an interview with Sky ahead of the game against United where he talked a lot about, in some ways, kind of the next step for Arsenal and another evolution. So maybe when you're talking about kind of that evolution at Atletico and then reining it back into what Simeone, is kind of like what's tried and tested and knows works, rather than trying to go to that. Because I remember the amount of times I saw Atleti in the market signing players like Thomas Lemar, for instance, thinking, okay, they're going for it. They're trying to change something, to take them forwards, and then went back to what they knew and would, dig in against the big sides again to get to the Champions League latter stages by frustrating, but still playing some good football because they brought in some of those technical individual talents as well. So with Arsenal in this upcoming season and in the summer, obviously, naturally, all of the attention is on the centre forward position because everybody knows that that's the one area that Arsenal are lacking in, that is foretold to take them to the title. That is the gap between them being second and ultimately closing that gap now to, it was City, but of course now to Liverpool as well. With that experience, with that, and as you mentioned, you alluded to it, that Joao Felix situation, huge money on a Mendes, I believe, right, a client at the time.
Yeah.
How confident would you be that Berta would be the guy to provide the unicorn that Arsenal fans have been longing for?
Yeah, I mean, the Joao Felix case is an interesting one because bear in mind, of course, that while Joao Felix is clearly very, very talented, and in fact, there's a really, I think a really nice, nice maybe not the right word, but I think it's a nice video of, and I can't remember if it's definitely Jan Oblak, and I think it's Saul Niguez he's talking to, and the cameras catch them coming out the tunnel, I think at half time, and one of them basically says, "Wow, just how good is he's amazing, this kid, Joao Felix is amazing." And then the other one says, and I must confess, and apologies for this, I can't remember which way around it is. And the other one says, "Yeah, when he wants to be, he's the best." and I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. And it's true that I think that created a little degree of tension because Joao Felix, I don't think there's any doubt, was an institutional signing, was a club signing, and this is a superstar in waiting. But bear in mind, I think he was 18, maybe 19. They paid 120 million euros for him, more than they've ever spent before. And you mentioned Lemar. Lemar was the most expensive until then at 80 million. And he was another one that it sort of worked in patches and then didn't always work. And actually, I think if you look back at the last league title that Atletico won, the first half of the season, the second half of the season were really quite different to each other. Not least because the first half of the season had a Joao Felix who played brilliantly. And the second half of the season, after an ankle injury and a few sort of problems getting back into the team, didn't quite work that way. And you had Atletico kind of trying to hold on to their lead in terms of points, almost as if they're in the 85th minute of a game. And it was like, right, we hold it, we just don't let it slip, and very nearly did let it slip. And then won lots of games late on and was very dramatic. And Luis Suarez kept on rescuing them and so on. But so Joao Felix was slightly different because he was young and because it was an institutional signing. And I do think there's no doubt that there is a very strong feeling that was a Mendes decision with the club's relationship with Mendes, which possibly, in all probability, was helped by the relationship with Berta, but didn't necessarily rely on that this was bigger even than that. And that Simeone tried to find a place for him. And I actually think it's a fairly ugly thing to say, but I think Simeone is probably maybe not happy, but certainly relieved to see that João Felix hasn't gone somewhere else and been a huge success. Because, of course, part of the debate around that was whose fault is this?
Mm.
And it's true that Berta at times tried to kind of smooth the rough edges out in the relationship between João Felix and Simeone, because they clearly didn't get on. And they clearly had different perceptions of what it was they wanted to be. Now, I've gone around the houses a bit, but I'm going to come to your question very specifically.
That's fine.
That idea of buying a forward who is the unicorn, the one that absolutely pushes you over the line.
Yeah.
And the reason I mention this is that João Felix, in theory, in terms of talent, could have been that player. And when you're spending 120 million euros, you shouldn't get it wrong. And it really and truly, if you're spending 120 million euros, you shouldn't need much for a sporting director, because we all know who the best 5 or 6 strikers in the world are. But João Felix was a kid. It's not the same as the other signings for Atletico Madrid. So I think when you ask about Berta identifying that forward, I think it's a slightly different question. And I must admit, there's a bit of me that thinks, and this is maybe a little bit over dismissive or a little bit over smart-assed, but I think if you're actually genuinely talking about the striker, your choices are relatively limited. It seems to me that actually the question mark there is, can you get them rather than can you identify them? Because I think identifying them is relatively easy. Relatively, obviously, there's no guarantee that. But to give you an example, Cunha, obviously currently now playing in England. Berta was very keen on that deal. Cunha was part of that kind of environment of Portuguese players. I must admit, I'm not sure if he's represented by Mendes or not. I think he might be. And Simeone had his moments with him, but wasn't always completely convinced. And to be fair, probably rightly so. But now he's emerging. So I think can Berta get that deal done is slightly a different question to can he identify who that forward is. And I think that when Atletico have spent very big money, it hasn't always been as successful as you might expect. I mean, as I say, their 2 biggest signings until Julian came this summer were Lemar and João Felix. And I think both of those are very much in that category of debatable, possibly even debatable, leaning towards not entirely sure this was successful.
Yeah, I think that's, and it's interesting because the next one, and of course the next big signing, as you mentioned, Julian Alvarez, kind of also fits into that not very athletic, in terms of
absolutely.
So it's interesting that was that next step, and that Simeone seemingly there was still faith, or not. Maybe it's a case of not necessarily faith, but he's the guy that's got to get the deals done. He's identified that Julian Alvarez is on the market, potentially available and gettable, and it's like, this is a must signing for us. Because when of the next opportunity you're going to get a player as good as him come up on the market, leaving a club as good as City, because no other club has an Erling Haaland ahead of a player as good as Julian Alvarez. So that's key. I'm conscious of the time. There was 2 other things I wanted to ask you. Fans obviously are very keen to know more about Martin Zubimendi, of course, as well. The change of sporting director, he will obviously inherit some of the work that has been done already behind the scenes. And I imagine that Arsenal would not have looked to appoint somebody that wasn't willing to take on some of all of the work that has been done behind the scenes. And, from my knowledge, Arsenal have put in a lot of work already with Zubimendi as well, and in that situation. But so did Liverpool. and we know how that went down. So it's no guarantee. But what do you make of the signing of Zubimendi and potentially him being a replacement for who we expect to be leaving in the summer, Thomas Partey?
Yeah, I mean, look, the first thing to say is I think Martin Zubimendi is a brilliant player, a really brilliant player, and I think he fits that role really, really well. I've sometimes wondered this, and actually I've had this discussion with colleagues who obviously follow Arsenal. I know you follow Arsenal far more closely than I do about the roles of Rice and Merino. Who's the 6 and who's the 8, or are they both a bit of both, and they sort of interchange? And Zubimendi is that pivot midfielder. And he's a ball-playing pivot midfielder. Now, it's an easy comparison to draw for lots of reasons, but the Xabi Alonso comparison is the one that's always drawn because, of course, they're both at Real Sociedad, because Xabi Alonso was Zubimendi's coach in the Real Sociedad B team, because Xabi Alonso has always spoken so highly about Zubimendi, and he talks about Zubimendi as a player who only thinks of the team, never of himself, who plays that role. I think he's different to Xabi Alonso. Don't expect those 40-yard diagonals. You're not getting those, but I think you're getting more.
Arteta don't play long ball.
You're getting that, you're getting that dynamism in midfield. You're getting I mean, Zubimendi's not obviously an athlete, and you don't look at him and think, right, this is an athlete, but he's clever. He gets to the places he has to get to. He moves the ball on simply. I think it works really, really well. I'd be interested actually to see what the roles of Marino and Rice would be with him. And there where Martin Ødegaard goes in all of that as well, whether it becomes a 4, how you position them if that is the case, whether you can then find space to have a couple of wingers as well. Maybe Marino ends up being up front forever. I mean, maybe this is genuinely a move for him. To be honest, I can't see it.
Neither can I.
But Zubimendi was very close to Liverpool in the summer. Talking to Alex Ramiro last week, who's the goalkeeper at Real Sociedad, and he said that after the Euros, he'd booked a house in Ibiza and basically invited all the Real Sociedad players from the Euros. And he said, one by one, they kept ringing me. I can't make it. I've got things to deal with. There's kind of stuff on the cards. And that one of those players was Zubimendi. He said, I'm back in San Sebastian. He said, well, what are you doing? He said, no, I've got some stuff to sort out. He said, no, wait, don't go. Not now. Just hang on a year. And I think he is a natural fit for a team, any team in England that wants the ball and wants to move it well and wants to move it with, I would say, with intelligence rather than trying to be the player. And I think in that sense, he's a really, really good fit. Now, look, again, maybe it's a bit too simplistic. I don't know enough about Arteta's kind of personal predilections in terms of players and his relationship, but it feels to me like a really natural fit.
It's really exciting. I mean, when De La Fuente was talking about, he lost the best 6 in the world and was able to bring on the next best 6 in the European Championship final. That says everything.
To be fair, I don't want to kind of burst the bubble, but to be fair, that's partly De La Fuente trying to big up his own players.
Of course.
But he's absolutely right. I mean, I do think Zubimendi. One thing I will say is that I think. And I would say this anyway, because it's sort of naturally the way I tend to see these sort of things. But I think it's worth saying to Arsenal fans, be patient with him. Because I think the first couple of months, he might find quite difficult. But I think he's talented enough that he will find his place eventually.
If it is to come off, and there's a lot of positive signs regarding that deal, it is really exciting. I think it's so good for an Arteta-style player as well for that midfield. Yeah. Lastly, this will be going out on Tuesday morning. I'll be heading off to Mikel Arteta's press conference ahead of the game against PSV, which is as close to a dead rubber as you can get it after a 7-1 away victory. And it sets up another trip to Spain for Arsenal, who will be guaranteed to play at least one of Atletico Madrid or indeed Real Madrid. How the stars of align that Andrea Berta's former side could be playing his new club. There's an interesting question going around Arsenal supporters with this right now, and that's that Real Madrid are the team that you would imagine to be feared more, just on paper with everything. But ironically, Arsenal have done so much better against teams that attack and come out, that there's almost this weird vibe that they almost would prefer to play Real Madrid because they'd have a better chance against them than a team like Atletico that probably play into all of Arsenal's weaknesses and could exploit them. So I just wanted to finish the show with your thoughts on either dynamic of the draw.
Yeah. I mean, I must admit, as a sort of a natural inclination, I would probably agree with that. Partly because, of course, I think the nature of obviously watching a club a lot is that you start to see the weaknesses in a club that has enormous strengths, and Real Madrid have absolutely enormous strengths, but structurally they're not a particularly good team. And that is a reality. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Structurally, they are not very good at the moment, particularly with the injuries. They've had problems defensively. They've had problems in midfield. I think if you look at their defeat at Betis a week ago, they were completely outrun through the middle of the pitch. Betis completely controlled the game. This weekend, Rayo Vallecano, who aren't a team that in theory want a huge amount of possession. They're quite direct. They're quite dynamic. They had 20 shots. Real Madrid had 10 at the Bernabeu. And they had 62% of the ball. And this isn't a team, Raya, that look for the ball necessarily. I think if you look at the first leg against Atletico Madrid in the Champions League, now, if you make an accusation at Atletico Madrid, and it's the accusation a lot of people have made, it's why didn't you move in for the kill? Because in terms of the pattern of the game, Atletico dominated for about an hour, maybe an hour, maybe 70 minutes, until Modric came on. and Madrid had a little bit more of the possession. And so in that sense, you look at it and you think maybe this does suit Arsenal more. And maybe if Arsenal can attack well, albeit, that question mark about the centre forward, Real Madrid are vulnerable. The thing is, of course, and this is not now a clever analysis, right? This is just experience. The thing is, Real Madrid, and it's a Champions League, and those bastards win, and they all win.
Yeah.
It sort of feels like it doesn't matter what happens. Now, obviously, look, I think there is. Look, I'm as guilty as anyone of looking at Real Madrid in the Champions League and doing almost exactly what I've just done there, which is to say somehow they find a way, and it's a miracle, and it's inexplicable. But on some levels, it's not a miracle and it's not inexplicable. It's just that, hang on, they've got Vinicius and they've got Mbappe and they've got Bellingham and they've got Rodrigo, and even the bad players at Real Madrid are very good players. And so, Brahim comes on, he's a sub and he's brilliant. Arda Güler's had a very poor season, but he's very, very talented. Everywhere you look at them, there is some way of doing it. And there is a bit of me that watches Real Madrid and thinks, if you're going to beat them, you've got to really beat them. Because if you give them half a chance, they're going to be there. And obviously, we saw that at Anfield, that Liverpool were just much, much better than them. And I think you have to be much, much better than them. Atletico, you're right in saying, I think are a different proposition for Arsenal. And it's hard to imagine Atletico if they were to play Arsenal, knocking Arsenal out comfortably. No matter what happens, it feels like that would be close. And I do feel like you can anticipate a game there where Arsenal would control, Arsenal would dominate, Arsenal would maybe create chances, although probably find it quite difficult to do so. And Atletico Madrid would more or less settle for control, for protecting themselves and trusting that at some point they'll find a way through. One big caveat to all of that I should add, which is I think if you look at Real Madrid in the European Cup over the last 3 or 4 years, and certainly if you look at what Ancelotti is doing, I think Ancelotti has come to think, actually, our best plan is fairly deep, play on the break. So it might well be that when you come up against a team like Arsenal, whether you're Atletico or Real Madrid, you actually don't play enormously differently. The difference is Real Madrid have more to counter you with, and Atletico are probably better at the resistance part of it.
I've watched Arsenal get countered on by Leicester and Bournemouth, and no disrespect to these teams at all.
No,
but
absolutely. That's the approach. Yeah.
But any approach that has pacey wide players and a clinical finisher absolutely destroys Arsenal this season, because they just, and I saw it at the weekend with Manchester United, United and Amorim, sat back and absorbed pressure. And then whenever there was an opening, they went for Arsenal, and they got a goal from a free kick, obviously, but that came from a breakaway. And Arsenal just couldn't find their way through. Now, by the quarterfinals, Arsenal hoped that not only Gabriel Martinelli will be back and fully fit, he returned at the weekend, but even potentially Bukayo Saka could be back, which would be also huge. There is hope of that he could return to training in March and maybe have some capacity to play in April. But it promises to be a very exciting scenario. Now, knowing Arsenal, they'll now lose 7-0 to PSV on Wednesday night and go out. So
I think there are very few things that are certain in football, but I think that's one we can probably trust won't happen.
Sid, it's been an absolute joy to speak with you again, and in an Arsenal capacity as well. Tell people where they can find you and what you're going to be up to.
Well, I'll be at Barcelona against Benfica, and I'll be at the Madrid derby this week, and then obviously, as you say, I will almost certainly, I think we can say certainly, be watching Arsenal in the next round, and obviously talking about that with our podcast, the Spanish Football Podcast, and writing about it in The Guardian, and probably talking about it a bit on ESPN as well. And as I say, quite looking forward to seeing Arsenal come, because I mean the truth is that while I never completely disengage from English football, I don't get the chance to see teams as often as I would like. And I was obviously fortunate to be able to see Arsenal at Girona, and looking forward to seeing them in Madrid as well.
Thank you so much again, Sid, for your time. I genuinely really appreciate it, and the insight was excellent. Listeners, thank you so much for listening and appreciating the effort that goes into putting on this show. Even when I do this show every single morning at 8 a.m. Sid, and I'm unable to do it some mornings because press conferences and things like that. So it's great to be able to pre-record episodes to go out when I am unable to. But it will give me a slightly longer lane of about 10 minutes. But I'll take it.
You take the 10 minutes. You know what? Those 10 minutes of gold.
They are, absolutely, especially when you get back from Manchester last night at 1:30 in the morning.
Exactly,
you get about 3 hours. It was a long.
I mean, I'm sure there's a million listeners now with really tiny violins.
Yes,
playing
you poor thing.
It's such a terrible tragedy to have to do this for a living.
I know. We will soldier on and forth towards that game against PSV. Of course, we'll be rounding up on Wednesday morning at Mikel Arteta's press conference and the open training session, and hearing from one of the Arsenal players as well. I know who it is, but I can't tell you yet. But it'll be a good one, and hopefully one where we'll learn a little bit more about their future. Have a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. We'll see you soon, and as always, up the Arsenal.